Now this slide, I always use this slide because this work was done in 1984 by Katrine Baghurst, whom I'm sure you know, and she was requested to turn up at the Southern Cross nursing homes and have a chat to the nursing sisters, I suppose you'd call them. And they were getting a little fed up with the people who were elderly people who were suffering from constipation, and really suffering because they didn't go to the toilet, they were taking aperients, laxatives, and having manual extraction of stool. And you can look at that figure of their average fibre consumption was, in those days, was measured by, I think, the Southgate measurement, and it was about 14 grams per person per day. So by the simple expedient of eating whole grain breads, whole grain biscuits, breakfast cereals, particularly wheat-based breakfast cereals, she was able to abolish the need for laxatives completely. And the number of bowel actions per day went up. It was perhaps, to my mind, a classic demonstration of the effect of dietary fibre on laxation and relief of constipation. And if you look at the fibre data, the figure of about 14 grams per person per day is interesting. We don't know quite how much people were eating in those days, but that is not an unreasonable figure. It's certainly close to the figure of fibre consumption in the United States, countries such as the United States, Canada, the UK, and so on. The figure of 25.4 is close to our fibre consumption now. So, there are a number of conditions where grain components have a potential role. There's simple constipation. It's largely not but completely resolved in Australia. Not completely, because you'll hear that there are people practicing wheat avoidance, and there are people who simply do not get enough fibre. But compared to other countries, we're doing all right. Colorectal cancer, major cause of death and disability, 4,400 deaths, 12,000 new cases a year. So grain components really do have an opportunity, or really do have a potential role, and a demonstrated role, I should say, in constipation, and a potential role in colorectal cancer. There are other conditions, IBS, IBD, infectious diarrhea. There are other conditions now where it's beginning to emerge that the microbiome and fibre may have a role. These include chronic obstructive airways disease, and there is serious discussion about the idea that some neurodegenerative conditions may have their origin in the gut. Diabetes, I forgot to mention that. It's emerging rapidly in countries in Southeast Asia, South and East Asia. So these are recommended fibre intakes. I've rounded them up to 30 grams per person per day, and Australia is doing all right based on population data, limited population data. We are consuming on average about 27 grams per person per day. The US, the UK and Japan are not. In fact, the Japanese government, I believe, has declared the Japanese diet to be fibre deficient. That's the threshold for regularity. So above that, you stand a reasonably good chance of going to the toilet every day when you want to. But there is a paradox. According to theory, the fibre hypothesis is that if you eat a lot of dietary fibre, you will not get the diseases of affluence. Well, we've got what we call the Australian paradox. We have very high fibre intakes relative to some countries, perhaps double, and that about 27 grams per person per day. And this is largely as wheat fibre. But we also have the second highest colorectal cancer rates in the world, and they're going up. Now, according to theory, this should not happen. And it's all wrong based on the Burkitt fibre hypothesis. The rate should be going down. Well, the reason for the paradox? The original fibre studies compared South African blacks with white, and the whites were eating refined carbohydrates, refined diets. The blacks were eating whole grains. They were thought to eat a lot of fibre. They don't, actually. They probably eat less than we do. What they do is they eat whole grains, largely maize, and they have a cooking practice which has largely fallen out of use in affluent societies. They eat it cold after cooking. They make a flour, and people who've been to South Africa talk about this. They make this flour, they grind, after grinding, they cook it, and then they'll store it. And we used to do the same. We used to do the same with porridge. We used to do the same with potatoes. Because fuel was expensive. That's a plausible reason. But what happens is you get gelatinization of the starch. So cooking breaks up the starch chains. That's cooking in water. And then on cooling, you get the chains reassociate. So they form helices. and aggregates that are resistant to digestion, and that passes through the small intestine. Jane Muir did a great deal of work in this area. And the big difference between RS, resistant starch, which the real name is enzyme-resistant starch, is that it doesn't work through itself. It works through its fermentation products. It doesn't work through bulking. In fact, it's a very poor bulking agent. Those data just show you, if you look at the top, Japan, which used to have one of the lowest rates of colon cancer in the world, these data are from 2002. I've chosen this quite deliberately because the latest incarnation of this, they've lumped Japan in together with China and other countries. But if you look back to 2002, and if you go to the World Cancer Statistics, I can't remember what the publication's called, you will see that Japan has got the highest rate in the world. Australia and New Zealand, the second highest, and affluent countries have high rates also. So food sources of resistant starch, most modern processing makes most starch foods highly digestible. There are few sources: unripe bananas, pulses like baked beans, foods with high maize, which was the first ingredient, a high amylose maize starch, which was the first ingredient in the marketplace with high resistant starch on processing. That's through because it's got a particular proportion of amylose, which is one of the two polymers. There are specialty products like rye bread and cooked and cooled starchy foods. This translates, though, to very low resistant starch intakes. And I'm going to give a plug for CSIRO, which is, I'm in the Food Futures flagship, and what we're doing is expanding food sources of RS. And the first one we've got off the rank is barley max, which is a high amylose barley. The other thing which I'm not going to discuss today is that there are a class of fibre components found in wheat which are actually removed largely by processing, and they're the arabinoxylans, and they may also play a big role in fermentation. But I'm not going to discuss that today. So modern diets are very low in RS. These two columns on the right, the purple one is resistant starch. This is data from ileostomists. And ileostomists allow you to collect all the starch that would otherwise, and other components that would otherwise enter the large bowel. And in this study, which was by Anne Burkett and others, resistant starch was increased by including whole grain breads and cereals, legumes in the diet. You can see there that the blue bar shows the typical Australian diet, and Tony Bird did this work in 2003. And he's expanded that database to show that in processed foods, such as you buy off supermarket shelves, the levels of RS in the diet are very low. That just shows you the gut microbiology and the fact the action occurs in the large bowel, and you've got more bacteria alive in your body than there are cells of you. The products are in adults and children now more bacteria, gases, and in breastfed babies, short-chain fatty acids and ethanol. The principal products are acetate, propionate, and butyrate, and these are thought to be the factors that promote gut health. In babies, breastfed babies, the bacterial population is different, and they don't make propionate and butyrate. So that's a very persuasive argument, I think, for breastfeeding. And this just shows you that in Africans consuming their stale maize porridge, they excrete an awful lot more short-chain fatty acids and butyrate than the fresh maize porridge, which supports the idea. Butyrate has a large number of actions which I won't go into because I'm running out of time because I've put too many slides in. But they show you, there's a huge background of experimental data to show you that there are effects of short-chain fatty acids. Propionate, the other acid, there are three major acids. Propionate has similar effects to acetate, but at much higher concentrations. Well, we don't know quite what acetate does. This is a trial which Manny and I and others did to show you that the Barley Max product increases the excretion of butyrate, because we're paying a great deal of attention to butyrate because it seems to be the one that promotes gut health the most. So feeding a refined wheat diet to people, you get an excretion of about 2.8 millimoles per day. Wholemeal wheat, that's a whole grain product. As one would expect and hope, it put up the butyrate. But barley max, which is a source of resistant starch, put it up even more. And the difference between the refined wheat and the barley max is actually the difference between the black South Africans at 5.4 and the white South Africans at 2.8. And putting it into practice, so fibre is important, maintain consumption, eat high fibre and whole grain foods, encourage the consumption of whole grain bread and pasta for resistant starch, brown rice, high fibre breakfast cereals, rye breads, legumes, I should say breads with high maize in them, cold cooked potatoes, rice and pasta, and of course firm bananas, barley max. There is also, for those who are interested, a high resistant starch laxative called Nucalox, which for those people who can't tolerate cereal products, you could consider. That's for you as dietitians. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much for a great presentation.